Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a really fascinating look at an article by Mark Bates from Rabbit Room Apologetics. We're going to see how scholars actually use strict historiographical rigor to analyze the historical facts behind the resurrection. So we're treating a biblical claim exactly like a historical cold case. Now, just to be clear right up front, we aren't looking at this from a theological or faith-based perspective today. No, we're looking at this strictly through the lens of ancient historical methodology.
Right, so here is the thought-provoking question at the very heart of our exploration today. Can historians look at a 2,000-year-old miraculous claim and actually analyze it objectively? To answer that, we're going to look at how scholar Gary R. Habermas developed what's known as the minimal facts method to evaluate this entire ancient mystery.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for the investigation. We'll cover the verification problem, move into the detective's toolkit, lay down the historical bedrock, test out the alternative theories, land on the best historical explanation, and wrap up with the cosmic redemptive climax.
Let's start with Section 1, the verification problem, or the scene of the crime. So we have to start with a pretty major hurdle. Can we actually know what happened in the ancient past with any real degree of certainty? The source notes that we're usually deadlocked by two totally unhelpful extremes here. On one side, you've got post-Enlightenment positivism. This basically demands, time machine-level scientific certainty, or just outright excludes any supernatural event before even looking at the evidence. Then, on the totally opposite side, you have radical postmodern skepticism. This view basically throws its hands up and says all history is just fake news, just a collection of subjective biases from ancient authors. And as you can probably guess, both of these extremes completely paralyze any real historical investigation.
Moving on to Section 2. The detective's toolkit, or the minimal facts method.
To bypass that deadlock we just talked about, scholar Gary Habermas uses a bottom-up toolkit. It's really designed to just skip the endless philosophical arguments and go straight to the raw data. The primary tool here, it's called critical realism. Think of it practically. Sure, we obviously don't have a time machine to get 100% mathematical proof of the ancient past, but through disciplined inquiry, we absolutely can figure out what adequately corresponds to reality. Next up, the method uses what's known as the Iliad Principle. Basically, this asks us to set aside all theological presuppositions, so no assuming the Bible is divinely inspired. Instead, historians treat the biblical texts exactly like classicists treat Homer's Iliad, just treating them as ordinary, highly biased ancient source documents. The methodology insists that, hey, even in highly biased texts, standard historical criteria can still extract genuine historical facts. Well, how do we actually find those genuine facts? To be considered a minimal fact under this method, a data point has to meet two incredibly strict criteria. First off, it must be backed by multiple independent lines of evidence. Second, there has to be a heterogeneity of scholarly consensus. What does that mean in plain English? It means a vast majority of credentialed scholars literally have to agree on it. And that consensus must include atheists, agnostics, and extreme skeptics, not just believers. That brings us to Section 3. The historical bedrock, which is all about the undisputed evidence. Let's look at the actual historical bricks scholars lay down to build their case. According to Habermas, and get this, he has cataloged over 4,500 academic sources since 1975. This core list of historical facts is conceded by virtually all credentialed specialists, totally regardless of their worldview. These bedrock facts include Jesus' death by lethal Roman crucifixion, the fact that the disciples genuinely experienced what they firmly believed were visual encounters with Jesus after his death, the sudden transformation of his skeptic brother James, and of course the transformation of the hostile persecutor Paul. Check out this quote from Bart Ehrman. He is a very prominent, well-known atheist New Testament scholar. In history, there's this thing called the criterion of embarrassment. It basically means that when a scholar who fundamentally rejects the supernatural firmly agrees on the crucifixion and the subsequent beliefs of the disciples, it carries immense historical weight. It proves these bedrock facts aren't just, Christian talking points. They are widely recognized historical data. And the proximity of this evidence, it's absolutely fascinating. When we talk about the disciples' visual experiences, scholars look at the oral creed preserved in the book of 1 Corinthians. Now, critical scholars agree this creed dates to within just 1 to 3 years of the crucifixion. In ancient history, having sources that date to within 1 to 3 years of an actual event, that is incredibly rare. It basically shatters the whole idea that this was just some legend that slowly evolved over centuries. Okay, on to Section 4, testing competing alternative theories, or interrogating the suspects. With our bedrock facts fully established, the methodology shifts to interrogating the suspects. Actually, what we're doing here is interrogating the naturalistic alternative theories using C. McCullah's criteria for the best explanation. For a historical theory to be valid, it must have scope, meaning, does it cover all the facts? It needs power. Does it explain them without straining? It must be plausible in its context. It has to be less ad hoc, which just means relying on fewer wild, unevidenced guesses. And finally, it must illuminate the surrounding data.
So when we actually run the standard naturalistic theories through these criteria, they kind of hit a brick wall. Take the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus just fainted. That completely fails because Roman crucifixion was brutally, scientifically lethal, and honestly, a half-dead bleeding man wouldn't inspire a triumphant global movement. What about the theft or conspiracy theory? That fails too because, psychologically speaking, people just do not willingly suffer and die for a lie that they themselves invented. And the super popular hallucination theory? It totally fails the scope test. Hallucinations are private, subjective events, right? They don't explain collective group visions, they don't explain the empty tomb, and they certainly don't explain why hostile, murderous enemies like Paul would suddenly convert.
That leads us right into Section 5, the best historical explanation, or the verdict.
The really crucial point here is this. If all the standard naturalistic theories fail under strict academic scrutiny, what exactly is the verdict? The source argues that when we rigorously apply this minimal facts method, the resurrection hypothesis, which is the premise that God actually raised Jesus bodily from the dead, is what naturally emerges as the superior historical inference. According to this analytical framework, it actually succeeds beautifully on McCullah's scale. It has complete explanatory scope. It easily accounts for the empty tomb, the early creeds, and all those visual experiences. It has high explanatory power because it perfectly explains the radical, basically overnight transformations of the disciples and hostile enemies without having to strain the data at all. It is highly plausible within a first-century Jewish context. And crucially, it's far less ad hoc. Why? Because it relies on just a single metaphysical premise, that a God exists and acted in history, rather than demanding a cascading series of highly improbable, totally unevidenced coincidences that the naturalistic models require.
Finally, we reach Section 6, the cosmic redemptive climax, the wider context.
Because a historical fact never really exists in a vacuum, the source finally zooms out to place this verified event into the broader context of biblical theology. To really grasp the ancient Hebraic worldview the early Christians operated in, you have to look at the three cosmic rebellions that fractured history. First, the Adamic fall, which introduced human mortality. Second, the Watcher's transgression, introducing widespread depravity. And third, the Babel disinheritance, where rebellious nations were allocated to lesser divine beings. The entire biblical promise plan was essentially a historical narrative designed specifically to reverse these massive cosmic fractures. So, viewing it from this wider perspective, the source asserts that the historical bedrock points to the resurrection not as some isolated apologetic magic trick, but as the literal, physical, space-time, verifiable climax of God's entire redemptive purpose. It was the specific moment of reversing that ancient cosmic rebellion, vindicating the Messiah, and jump-starting the restoration of a fractured cosmos. And this historically anchored event also validates what theologians call non-supersessionist theology. Simply put, this is the view that Gentile inclusion reclaims those disinherited nations from Babel and actually expands God's covenant. It unites all nations without replacing or annulling the irrevocable promises originally made to ethnic Israel. The historical reality of the resurrection is basically the engine making all that cosmic reconciliation possible.
It is such a fascinating look at how rigorous academic tools can be applied to ancient texts. We're going to leave you with this final thought to chew on today. When we treat ancient claims not just as abstract theology or, mere mythology, but instead apply strict, ordinary historical methodology to them as raw data, how does that challenge our assumptions about the past? Does viewing history through the lens of critical realism change what you actually think is historically possible? Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and we will definitely see you next time.